Welcome, everybody. This is much anticipated. We've been, I think we had a promise of it last year, and then unfortunately we didn't get to see it this year. But this now we've got the wonderful Professor Jane Lydon, who's going to be talking to us about Port Essington. We're extremely excited about this. Before we proceed, I will mention that I am on the unceded lands of the Kulin Nations here in Naarm, more commonly known as Melbourne. And we thank elders past and present, in particular for the support that they've given to us, to this project, and to the research that we do more generally. Jane is a long-term friend and a long-time collaborator and an affiliate of our program, and some of the work she's done has been absolutely instrumental in getting us to think about some of the ways in which the Macassan history might be reconsidered. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Jane Lydon from the University of Western Australia. Over to you, Jane.
Thank you so much, Lynette, and it really is fantastic to be here. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from the traditional country of the Whadjuk Noongar people, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. And I also acknowledge, I'm speaking to you, and as you've already said, Lynette, you're on pay my respects to Wurundjeri, Barnarong and other Kulin Nations elders and community members. Also like to thank David and Lynette very much for their patience. As Lynette mentioned, I hope to give this seminar a year ago, and it's been a wonderful privilege to actually find time to do more research on this area, which I love so much, in amongst everything else. I'd like to start by paying tribute to a colleague too soon, and who I know was a treasured member of the Global Encounters team. Dr. Lily Yulianti-Farid was advancing research about links between Macassans and First Nations Australians, and her loss earlier this year is profound. So I just want to start by noting her absence and paying my respects to her life and work as well.
Thank you.
And finally, before I start, I also want to acknowledge that I know that this has been a very hard week for a lot of people. World events, national events, and other calamities have affected many of us. So I speak today about historical connections between people with these legacies very much in mind. I think visual culture offers a very immediate way into other worlds, but that very connection can also be misleading. Fundamentally, I find the images I study a really wonderful way of evoking a sense of identification with other people. Even though I may never actually know what it's like to sail on a prow from Port Essington, I think that images and visual culture is probably as close as I will get. It's a really powerful, visual culture is a powerful way to engage with those other encounters and experiences. And of course, if anyone is looking for a crew member for such a voyage, just want to say now that I am your person. It would be such a dream. So in contributing to this seminar series about global encounters, today I want to talk about images produced by European travellers to the Cobourg Peninsula, and specifically their perceptions of the trepang or sea cucumber industry. We now call this the Macassan trade, part of a substantial and varied maritime economy comprising a range of resources, cultures and places spanning Southeast Asia. This talk comes out of research I've been doing for some years. Initially, I thought it would be, what a wonderful article or book chapter this would be to survey European representation in the industry. That was very naive, because there are just so many images that I've come to realise that it's a much bigger project. So today I'm confining myself to a series of images produced at Port Essington between 1839 and 1845, which was a time of great imperial rivalry, but also the thriving exchange entailed by the industry. So I'm just going to start sharing my screen. Now, hoping that you can see that full screen now and that you can now see a map. Please just yell out if, yeah, great. Terrific. So, as many of you know, from its origins in the 18th century, trade with Bugis, Bhutanese, Timorese, Moluccans and Papuan sailors and more travelled with the northwest monsoon in December from Macassan, which you see here in the province of South Sulawesi in the Celebes, and again Macassan here, down to the southeast to Australia, which they called Merege. Can't do the glottal stop at the end, but they were referring to the Arnhem Land coast, and Kayu Jawa, the Kimberley. So this centuries-old exchange between fishermen travelling from South Sulawesi to in Indonesia and the First Nations people on Australia's northern coast reveals the cosmopolitan networks characterising this region. So as we know, I think part of the appeal of this history is that it undermines the narrative of fatal British impact starting in 1788 on a pure primordial Indigenous race. So here is the trepang in his natural state and after processing. This is what it was all about. And of course, in great demand in Chinese markets, which provided, the ultimate destination for much of these catches. While the colonial Australian administration, increasing restrictions were implemented over the 19th century, and it was finally outlawed to Indonesians in 1907. It did continue, of course, in different ways up until the present day. The trade has received renewed attention in recent decades as scholars and descendants recognise the complexity and vitality of the economic, kinship and cultural exchange this industry entailed. I want to start today by looking at two iconic images of the trade on the Cobourg Peninsula at the Victoria settlement, which we perhaps know better as Port Essington. Then I'm going to explore something of their context and what they tell us about relations between all participants. The First Nations people who spoke Awaja and Garrick languages.
Sorry, Jane, just excuse me. You keep freezing a little bit, so maybe we'll get you to turn your camera off just while you're doing the slideshow.
Right. Now that will be stop video. Is that
perfect?
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, great, thank you. So the very complicated cultural relations between First Nations people, the British, the French, and the so-called Malays, which is what the British and other Europeans called the very mixed race, multicultural crews. We know that encounters with different peoples were shaped by the objectives and actions of all participants. This is what Bronwyn Douglas has termed Indigenous countersigns. Her contention that words written and pictures drawn by voyagers in the context of encounters with local inhabitants are imbued with signs and ambiguous countersigns of Indigenous agency. So as we know, this kind of argument is now well established and has prompted many analyses which read traces of the past for what they tell us of all sides of the exchange. This is also an approach we now bring to visual images simply as a record of authorial intention. On Dumont d'Urville's third expedition to the region, aboard the Astrolabe and the Zélé, the artists Ernest, Goupil and Louis Le Breton produced scenes from their visit to the Cobourg Peninsula, which was in March and April 1839, including trepangers at work in Raffles Bay. So that is the first of these iconic images that you see here, which he called trepang fishers in Raffles Bay. Similarly, Harden Sidney Melville produced a series of views and portraits during the surveying voyage of HMS Fly between August 1843 and June 1845, which was the basis for this iconic scene of a trepanging workshop at Raffles Bay. And I'll just quickly note that between 1843 and 1845, this image wasn't published until 1862. I think it's interesting that both these very different images, which I'm going to come back to in a moment, are still widely used today. They're kind of shorthand or an illustration of the trade and its history. So, for example, the National Museum of Australia, in its defining moments, has an episode devoted to the trade, and it uses Melville's engraving at the top. My screenshot doesn't really do it justice, but it's a wonderful sort of interactive resource. And as you scroll down, Melville's engraving is very prominent at the top. And then you see this lovely portrait of another trepang below. And I think Louis Le Breton's image is also widely used, for example, in this ABC article by the wonderful Erin Park that was published earlier this year as part of an ABC story. And you can see here, this is a hand-coloured version of Le Breton's image. Okay, so the industry. By around 1800, the trepang industry was seen by European powers as part of the strategic value of the North, along with other advantages they saw in controlling the region ahead of the French. Two previous attempts to establish settlements in the region had failed. The first, Fort Dundas settlement on Melville Island between 1824 and 1829. Here we are, and Fort Wellington on the east coast of the Cobourg Peninsula between 1827. Here we are, Melville Island, you see here. And then this detail shows the short-lived Fort Wellington, British settlement in Raffles Bay, and then Victoria on the west side of Port Essington itself. So Victoria was established in 1838 and it only operated until 1849. It was imagined by its proponents as a new Australian Singapore. The local landowning Aboriginal group at Victoria was the Madjinbalmi clan, who spoke Garrig, as well as the languages of neighbouring Cobourg clans with whom they intermarried, such as Awaja, Wuraku and Marku. Macassan trepangers visited the Port Essington settlement for the first time in March 1839, coinciding with D'Urville's visit. And I think this is a really remarkable aspect of its 11-year history. There was this incredible flow of visitors to Port Essington, which generated a really impressive and of course, George Windsor Earl, who was a booster for the settlement, noted of it that in April, when the prows arrived, the population of the settlement became of a very motley character. And he described how Australians of perhaps a dozen different tribes might be seen mixed up with natives of Celebes and Sumbawa, Badjus from Borneo, Timorians and Javanese, with an occasional sprinkling of New Guinea Negroes, and very singular groups they formed. So I think this speaks to the sort of the exoticism and the great relish that British and European observers felt when they observed this kind of cosmopolitan mixing. So the French expedition between 1837 and 1840 was commanded by Dumont d'Urville on his third and final voyage to the Pacific. As his sailors approached the Cobourg Peninsula in March 1839, they saw around 20 Macassan prows fishing and several Aboriginal people on its western shore. They were greeted by a British cutter from the nearby Victoria settlement who'd been informed by the trepangers, and no doubt the Aboriginal people, of their presence. So the British were clearly very nervous about the French, but D'Urville managed possession of Raffles Bay. The French anchored in Port Essington on the 7th of April, and they were treated as honoured guests. The French crew spent their time gathering natural history specimens. They visited the commandant, Captain Bramer, and they explored the settlement of Victoria. The two ship's artists, Ernest Goupil and Louis Le Breton drew trepangers at work and prows. They drew portraits of Aboriginal people in Raffles Bay and views of the settlement. And 7 lithographs based on their work were later included in Voyage to the South Pole and Oceania, which was Dumont d'Urville's official publication, his atlas. And I think it's important to note that d'Urville was acutely conscious of the value of his artist's work in documenting his achievements. In May 1838, while visiting Valparaiso in Chile, where rumours were circulated among the French vessels in the harbour that his expedition was a failure and that his ships had not entered the Strait of Magellan, as he'd claimed, but had sheltered at Concepcion. So what d'Urville did was to hold a dinner party for 2 French ship's captains and 2 prominent local French merchants, after which he showed them the expedition's charts and Goupil's and Le Breton's portfolios. They were impressed and his reputation was restored. The official artist Goupil, ignore that one, worked in the pastoral tradition of the 17th century French painter Claude Lorraine. So these were his heroes, Lorraine and the Flemish Cornelis Huysmans. So this is an example of each of those. They were both influential landscape painters who worked outdoors from detailed observation. Their landscapes were characterised by romantic but precisely observed forested landscapes with sharp contrasts in light and shade, as you can see here. In particular, Lorraine's Baroque classicism is evident in his inclusion of ancient ruins in many of his paintings. So these offered a kind of, I see them, you can see this here, this sort of Romanesque kind of ruin in the middle distance. Mm-hmm. And in Huysmans' landscape also, you can see these very evocative ruins. I think it's noteworthy that an interest in ruins was also characteristic of the French voyage, where the vessels took many opportunities to visit abandoned European settlements at a time when there were a lot of these experimental colonies to be found. Le Breton also made many studies of these picturesque and evocative traces. So I think it's interesting to see that he's possibly uniting this neoclassical taste for the ruin with a strategic concern to document European territorial ambition at these sites. Goupil's 2 published lithographs, Naturels de la Baie Raffles and Établissement Anglais à Port Essington, also express these concerns. So as you can see, they're romantic, neoclassical renditions of both people and landscape. This one, natives or Aboriginal people of Raffles Bay, as you can see, embody classical conventions to the extent that the 2 men here do not appear specifically Aboriginal. In fact, I have my doubts about these and I wonder whether in fact they are from another part of the voyage. But it's difficult to tell because they are so classicising. All 4 are graceful and poised, and these idealising portrayals were included in a separate volume in the publication, Anthropology and Human Physiology, which was a comprehensive overview that combined profile and full-face portraits, much as you see here. So the neoclassical conventions applied to the images, either by Goupil or by the lithographer Bayeux, make it difficult to see them as individual portraits. And of course, this is a period in which increasing attention to and a skull shape was also the basis for charting human varieties. D'Urville's 3rd voyage is well known for the phrenologist Dumontier's 51 life-cast busts of Indigenous subjects, which had been judged the pinnacle of empirical realism at this time. So they were very difficult to make, particularly for the living subjects who had to sit there with plaster all around their heads, breathing through straws while the plaster set, but they're incredibly detailed. Many descendants, actually, and artists now have reused these in works of art. Bronwyn Douglas suggests that de Moutier himself, while clearly a sympathetic humanist, tended to reify categories of race on the basis of his types, and others went further in building on de Moutier's collections to elaborate polygynous theories of race. Goupil's beautiful portraits express an inclusive and respectful view of these human subjects, which is significantly at odds with the racialised theories that were later developed. Goupil's only landscape of Australia, which was of the English settlement, Victoria, reveals an isolated bush village, picturesquely distributed across a receding forest plain. So, this is obviously very reminiscent of the work of his heroes, Lorraine and Huysmans. Very romanticising this lovely, lovely little picturesque village. But I think it's also interesting to note the very prominent termite nest in the dead tree here in the foreground, which I think to our eyes strikes a rather ominous note as a harbinger of the havoc that termites were to wreak on the settlement. So this was one of the major factors that was identified for the decay and demise of Victoria. By contrast with Goupil's romantic images, the naval surgeon Le Breton, his views express a more professional, business-like interest in the maritime industries he witnessed. So I think it's pretty evident that Le Breton had documents the core business of the expedition and its progress. I think this is probably one reason why this image continues to be so useful to researchers in the present. From a strategic perspective, Le Breton's meticulous accounting of the industry provided a step-by-step blueprint for the French. So, looking at this now, I think we can agree that he's showing an absolutely draftsman-like accuracy in showing us details of the industry. Noteworthy, I think, in Le Breton's rendition, his very factual rendition, is the absence of interaction between First Nations people and so-called Malays, in accordance with French observations of tension and distance between these groups. So what he does, details of prows, the fishermen, the crews, and their smaller boats. This very architectural, kind of perspectively accurate rendition of the drying huts. You could almost use these to rebuild them or recreate them in the present. And then again, these crews sitting around in the background, you can see people stirring the tripods. It's quite interesting to wonder exactly what they are doing, maybe repairing nets, sitting around, chatting, all sorts of local things. Again, the great detail of his observatory at Raffles Bay. So again, core business of the expedition was to take observations, and you can see many details of this very professional kind of workmanlike activity in progress. We also see details of the prows. So this is a page from the published atlas with the prows at the top. If we sort of focus in on this, again, this beautiful, detailed, finely observed rendition of the prows, a bit shabby, repaired, a bit messy. And this is actually one of my favourite details. I absolutely love this priest, identified by his Benedictine robes, sitting on the deck of the prow with one finger raised reprovingly toward two Malays who look guiltily away. I mean, this is just priceless, the way they're just with that single gesture. I think that whoever the French artist might be, he's signifying a lot about this moment of encounter, the reprovingly, the admonitory raised, and that men and just not meeting his eye. The expression on this man's face, I think, is absolutely fabulous. At first, I assumed that this priest could not be Angelo Confalonieri, who was the first priest at Port Essington and a graduate of Propaganda Fide, the Vatican Institute for Evangelization in Rome. And I assume that because he was only present at Port Essington from 1846 to 1848, which was after the French had gone. And I'm still looking for an explanation. So if anyone knows, please do tell me. But I then started to wonder whether this could be intended to represent an imagined Confalonieri added by Le Breton or even Eduardo Laplante, the editor of the Atlas, as it was in production after they had returned to France. Confalonieri had passed through Lyon, Paris and London in 1845 as the Atlas was in production on a recruiting. So it is possible that he encountered the team and was sort of added in this slightly satirical, humorous footnote. Le Breton's two views of the settlement at Port Essington, New Victoria, Port Essington and Port Essington No. 2, are noticeably different from Goupil's romantic landscape. Le Breton shows almost the same buildings as you see here. But rather than the sort of romantic forest and undulating terrain, each building is neatly recorded and ordered across the open space of the parade ground. He shows the settlement to be ramshackle and motley, planted on bare earth. Where Goupil's have this sort of Italianate grace, Le Breton's prominent pandanus in the foreground spikily and accurately proclaims its exotic location. Significantly, just note the white ensign or St. George's ensign waving from this central building, which I think is the quartermaster's office, which declares that this is a British naval settlement. His Port Essington No. 2 reverses that first gaze in looking from the settlement out to sea. So this is the pier and the jetty. We get in the foreground these abandoned barrels, abandoned cannons, bits and pieces. It's all very sort of messy. And we look out to the vessels. The British ensign again waves centrally twice, both from the flagstaff and also from the vessel moored beyond it. Again, I think these unequivocally and rather unflatteringly identify this ramshackle scene as British. So, as I've noted, French ambitions in the region have helped to push British colonisation along in the western and northern coastlines during the 1820s. The French accounts of their visit evoke this rivalry and universally emphasised the strategic limitations of the settlement. The French recognised the central strategic importance of trepang for British planning. Officers ridiculed the idea that Asian, Chinese or other regional settlers would be drawn to Victoria because this is what the British actually had in mind. They wanted to attract colonists from the region. One of the officers said, "I rather think it will share the fate of Raffles Bay and that the ships that put in here in a few years will be hard put to find any traces of it." So coming back to Le Breton's unflattering views, which show the miserable British huts perched on the shoreline, I think Le Breton here is expressing this bleak and, of course, quite accurate French prognosis for the future. One thing the images don't show us, however, is the varied and sometimes fraught local relationships between British, Aboriginal and so-called Malays. I think his New Victoria, Port Essington, hints at the polyglot community that throngs the Cobourg Peninsula, but it's very generalising rather than eyewitness. I mean, we have these sort of French-looking officers talking to members of the British settlement, but we don't see any Aboriginal people, for example, in this view. And Commander Jacquinot of the Zélé noted that although the First Nations people were regular visitors to the town, they were absent during the French visit. And this was because they'd had a brawl with Malay trepang fishermen a few days before their arrival, in which a native had been hurt. However, he also noted the prevalence of venereal disease among the Aboriginal people, pointing towards sexual relations. So, and we know from documentary records that relations between the Awaja and Garrig-speaking First Nations people and the British settlement were actually very harmonious throughout the settlement's life. There was only one case of violent bloodshed. And when the British left, the Aboriginal people went into mourning, and Aboriginal women in particular, grieved and regretted their loss. So I think this points to, a range of quite intimate relations that are simply not evident. This imitations of visual evidence. By contrast with French perspectives, the English artist Harden Sidney Melville's prolific views and portraits express his fascination with natural and human difference and the romance of trepanging. So I think this is, again, very different view of trepanging, but equally compelling in quite a different way from the Bretons. Melville was draftsman on board the HMS Fly between 1842 and 1846 under the command of Captain Frances Blackwood, which with her tender Bramble conducted the first official hydrographic survey of the northeast coast of Australia. So the now iconic trepang fishery is based on one of the Fly's 4 visits to Port Essington between August 1843 and June 1845, while this image purported to be an accurate eyewitness rendition of the industry. I think if we look at it a bit closer, we can see its cultural leanings or framework. And this is how it appeared in 1862. And sorry for the quality of the image, it's taken from a microfilm that I had quite a lot of trouble getting, actually. It took 3 requests through my library. Anyway, so with an eye to commercial appeal, Melville's professional account sought to portray his travels as a light-hearted, if risky adventure, heightened by the exoticism and uncertainty of encounters with Indigenous peoples. Melville frequently perceived the diverse peoples he encountered in stereotypical terms, yet they strength and life from his portrayals. For Melville, these exchanges were performative and exciting, always tinged with the possibility of danger and what he called treachery, but also frequently good-humoured and friendly. Melville later produced an autobiographical account of his experiences aboard the Fly, which he published around 1871, written for sort of young boys. In this, the young artist's decision to leave home was prompted by, as he put it, the army of schoolboy readings of romance and travel, and especially Captain Cook's voyages, in which he and his brothers and sisters were wont to revel on winter evenings at home. Melville imagined collecting cargoes of marvellous pictures and miraculous curiosities for the edification, admiration, and instruction of a wondering public. So his voyage aboard the Fly provided fertile material for commercial work, including via his father's printing business. It provided a very useful outlet for his later work. The text of his article in the Queen, which I've just shown you there, the trepang fishery, it quoted the geologist Joseph Beat Jukes' account of the fishing and curing process. Jukes was the expedition's naturalist who wrote the official account, the narrative of the surveying voyage of HMS Fly, published in 1847. Jukes assured the reader that in works of this nature, one line of plain fact is better than any heightened recollections, for the reader is apt to suspect the accuracy of details which are given apparently not because they are historical, but because they are amusing. So Jukes' line was that he was completely factual in his account. The Queen drew upon Duke's account in noting that the Malay fishers always anchored close to the British settlement. And indeed, the proximity of the English settlement was the greatest charm of the fishing ground, for the Malays had a great dread of the Aborigines. And as it was, the peace of the settlement was often disturbed by a collision between the parties. So I just want to note, this is actually a little bit counter to our interpretations in recent years, which have tended to and harmony. So Jukes went on to note that sometimes a friendship is formed between the natives and the Malays, but it is tied with a very loose thread. And when the trepang fisherman gets home, he thinks he sailed under a lucky star if he lands his cargo safely with he and his crew unscathed. So I think it's really important to note this kind of evidence for relations as well. And certainly as a professional artist, Melville was not so committed to factual accuracy. So the Queen noted that our illustration is from a sketch made on the spot, the only departure from the original being the introduction of 2 of the Aborigines with whom the captain of the prows is parleying. And you can see this over here on the left, 2 supposed First Nations people parleying the Malay captain. But I think that Melville's imagined edition, which is obviously quite fictitious, is quite significant in suggesting cordial everyday exchange between the Awager and the Malays, contrary to observation. But I think it has the effect of enhancing the scene's cultural richness and drama. So I think we can see here that in strong contrast to the French artist's careful and naturalistic observation, Melville's style was pretty impressionistic and sort of verging on fantastic. So, you know, I'll just to quickly point out, you've got this sort of, these figures are all crowded together. You don't have the sort of successive receding planes of perspective and the great perspectival accuracy, for example, in rendering the drying houses that we see with Le Breton. We have many of the same elements, but they're all squashed together and everything's happening all at once. You know, we see the tripods and things being cooked. We see trepang being carried off, taken up to these drying sheds. We see the catch being brought in here and so on and so forth. And the smoke and the sort of the detail, you know, the tropical background and the cliffs and the foliage creates this very busy, phantasmagoric sort of effect, I think. If we consider the wider visual context for this single image, we can see that Melville rendered fleeting encounters in visual collages which map Duke's often very long and detailed textual accounts. Melville produced 19 drawings and 2 maps for Duke's official narrative. His illustration for his chapter about Port Essington, which you see here, called Port Essington, shows a down-at-heel array of huts. And, you know, very untidy. You have a group of First Nations people around a little campfire in the square, goats, a man's just been hunting, wandering in, various sort of random details. While a detailed analysis of Melville's illustrations is beyond the scope of my talk right now, it's worth noting his remarkable frontispiece, Interview with Natives at Wickham River, which expresses the expedition's intimate and performative encounters with First Nations people. And this is just my photograph from it, so I can see it's a bit fuzzy. Sorry about that. But I hope you can see these absolutely remarkable encounters within this single vignette. It depicts a confused tangle of bodies and interactions, which conflate several encounters in 1843 at Cape Upstart, the traditional country of the Juru people. For example, Jukes wrote, "One man advanced to meet me, on whose head I placed the red cap." So it was the custom of the British expedition to give out red nightcaps to Aboriginal people they met and to dance. So he said he placed this red cap on his head, and then dancing corroboree fashion to each other, we immediately became good friends. and the rest came up. Captain Blackwood and Ince now joined us, bringing some biscuit, and we all sat down and held a palaver, laughing, singing, grimacing, and playing all kinds of tricks. And they had a really extended series of encounters. It was very friendly. Jukes had made a particular friend whom they christened Thomas. These elements of dance, curiosity, laughter, mischief, and exchange are all prominent within Melville's image. The artist shows himself in the foreground. I think this Melville here on the right, holding the sketch pad and a pen. And Jukes described how Melville made a portrait of Thomas, during which he was tolerably patient and very tractable, putting himself into the required attitudes, and when the sketch was finished, complementing it with a long whirr. Melville's portrayal of this lively encounter with the Juru echoes the open and playful approach characterising encounters between the young men. And I think it's also important to remember that these are all very young men, the British and the First Nations people they interacted with over this time. Melville also published a collection of 25 tinted lithographs, which capitalised on the success of Jukes' book by setting himself up as the pictorial version. And this is it here, held by the National Library of Australia. It's beautiful. It's a really gorgeous, would have been quite expensive little book. His preface, just to show you the first few pages, his preface, I'll just quote a little bit here. He says, as an artist, he's aware of the small merit they possess as pictures and wishes to rest their value solely on their being faithful representations of the object seen. Unfortunately, this has been diminished by the on the scale of the original drawings to make it a bit cheaper. But I think actually more than just reducing the scale, we can actually see many visual transformations in Melville's work. So he used a range of techniques such as conflating distinct events and moments into single scenes, for example. In his Natives at Port Essington, we see a group portrait comprising 5 men, 2 women, and a child. Both European and traditional ornaments, scarification, and weapons are carefully observed. And I think this mixture of tradition, but also signs of interaction with the British, is of great interest to Melville as a sign of exchange. This is a scene of barter and mutuality, which centres upon engagement between British. And again, I think there's a really interesting history of exchange between First Nations people and the British during the 11-year life of the settlement of Victoria. So just to conclude, just want to note that we see so much in these images, but there are things we don't see as well. We don't see the sometimes fraught local relationships between different groups. Instead, Melville's lively dramatic works foreground performance, curiosity, laughter, uncertainty, and mischief. They show us the open encounters between the British and First Nations people. Melville's techniques of selection, reduction, and conflation transformed and enlivened Jukes' account of exchange. The intimacy and colour of portraits such as this depict a mutuality shaping the signs and ambiguous countersigns of Indigenous agency. Thank you, and I'll stop sharing there.
Probably bring your screen back on. Yes, hopefully your screen can come back on.
Yes, just fumbling around with that. There we are.
There you are.
Hello.
Excellent. Thank you, Jane. That was terrific. And gosh, it's always beautiful to see Harden Melville images, isn't it? They're just gorgeous. I really love them.
Yeah.
We can open up to questions if you want to make yourself known or indeed put it in the chat. We can take a few questions. Oh, I'm going to just try and make it so that I can see everyone because I can't see them at the moment. So, sorry. Gallery. There we go. Oh, there you all are. Fabulous. Okay, good. All right. So, any questions?
Corrections, feedback.
Corrections, the feedback, all of those things.
Yeah, very puzzling.
I missed that. I wasn't sure who was speaking, but that's okay. Fantastic. I love the red caps, and I love the fact that people kept giving out these red caps. That we keep coming across this time and time again. And quite recently, well, not recently, it was actually last year, we were in Amsterdam and we were able to see a kind of a display case, and it was some the caps of native quote unquote native sailors who'd been working in various maritime industries. And there was a lot of red. It was obviously, it's really something that we probably need to unpack. It's interesting seeing Gay Sculthorpe here, because we've had a couple of questions from Tasmanian. Hey, Gay, we've had a couple of questions from Tasmanian. A couple of Aboriginal people in Tasmania have actually asked us about the red caps, particularly because that's something that they'd come across in historical images as well. So that's another thing that we can keep our eyes on for.
I would love it if Gay had any thoughts on that. Just very quickly, when I was reading Duke's account, he describes, Cape Upstart and the Wickham River, and of course they don't have those names today, as far as I could tell. So I was actually wondering, or many of the places that he names don't. So, even though I didn't talk very much about that part of the voyage, I would be very interested to hear from people like Ian McNiven, who do work in that part of Queensland, perhaps, or who know more about that, and their sort of, ethnographic or historical perspective on those sorts of encounters. But Gay.
Hi, everyone. A great talk, Jane. I really enjoyed all the images. And I was actually particularly struck in your last image with the man wearing the black hat.
Yes. Yes.
I thought that was a very striking image.
Is that the very final one?
Yeah.
I was just saying to Lynette, actually, before the talk. So I'm just going to go down to the end. I'm not sure whether you are seeing this, but so this one here, that is fascinating. And, along with these other sort of signs of exchange, it's sort of difficult to know. And some of the this man here, I find quite interesting, because I didn't include them in the PowerPoint, but he produced these scenes in Port Phillip. So there's a group of Kulin Nations people. He produced it. The next stop almost was, or the next image was in Hobart. And there was also one from the Swan River colony. And one of the figures in a very similar group, he identified as Wiley, who of course had accompanied Eyre across the Nullarbor, and then, remained in Western Australia. And Wiley in that image has sort of quite distinctive red colouring. So I also have a question about who this man might and whether he's been singled out in a particular way.
That's really interesting. And that shirt he's wearing is fascinating too.
That's right. And that they're, I think, drilling down into the sort of the detail of the interactions between the British and the First Nations people. There were a couple who became very close. So one was a man called Namail, who actually travelled to Sydney and Java and, travelled around with, I think, with the Scottish naturalist McGillivray, and then returned to the settlement and learned to read and write. He was later killed as retaliation in the only incident of violence in the settlement, as part of a sort of punishment for what had happened. But there was another man called Jack Charles, who also was a child at the time of the British settlement, and who then greeted visitors well into the 20th century. So anyway, I'm getting off the track here, but I think that there is more detail to be
Fantastic.
Uh,
I can't see if Ian is. Oh, there he is. He's actually only at the other end of the house, but I couldn't actually see him. So, Ian, I was wondering if you might like to comment.
Yeah. Oh, hi, Jane. Good
good to see
to
you.
see you. Yeah. And a lovely talk. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, you mentioned Melville's autobiography. It's a curious volume, isn't it? The first of which is he doesn't actually say it's written by him.
So
Well, actually,
that's
it says written by himself.
yeah. It is funny. I decided to call it a sort of autobiographical just for today, actually. But as you say, he sort of wrote it for, young readers, and he sort of changes the name, so the fly or the tender becomes the bumblebee, and changes names. I think it's called Voyage of a Young Griffin,
Yeah.
and he sort of. I think one of the interesting things is that he was a little bit critical of. He sort of described his voyage on aboard the Bramble, the HMS Fly, as almost a waste of time. But then he mined it, in his later work for quite a long time, and obviously was a commercial, grist to the mill for his commercial activities. But yeah, really, really interesting sort of insight into his own. He was collecting these cargoes of marvelous pictures, which really contrasts with Jukes, the scientists saying every word is true. They're obviously taking quite a different approach to the accounts.
And obviously, yeah, he goes back to England, yeah, as a commercial artist, following in his father's footsteps, who's also a famous sort of illustrator of books, etc. But I mean, yeah, you mentioned that like they're all young. I mean, yeah, he's 17 years old when he's doing this. I mean, he's very young.
Yeah.
But yeah, you do get. I find it interesting. I mean, I've really only read the Torres Strait dimension of it, but yeah, you get quite different sort of perspectives reading Jukes, and then you read his The Adventures of a Griffin, where it's much more playful, and he talks about sort of more sort of intimate sort of things taking place, like like people sort of Torres Strait Islanders coming onto the deck of the Fly and dancing around, and everybody's having a lot of fun and stuff. And he does those little sketches through the book as well, so you get quite a different sort of view of it. But then also Melville going back to England, and then even sort of later in life, continuing to do sort of illustrations of Torres Strait. And there's that wonderful painting that the NGV here in Melbourne purchased a couple of years ago of a painting of a canoes, the Torres Strait canoe down the east coast of Cobourg Peninsula, so which was in the 1870s. So which is curious, given it's a departure from his. Well, I guess he had to make money. So yeah, lots of romantic scenes of sort of horse and carts in English countryside. It seems to be how he made his sort of money.
I was saying, Ian, I mentioned earlier to Jane that you and Miles had written on that. And maybe you'd have, I don't know if you do have a PDF of it or something, but we could.
Yeah, in the NGV magazine. Yeah, and we're doing a more detailed version of that, and one that brings in sort of oral histories from Torres Strait as well of that voyaging, etc. So yeah, there's sort of more work to be done there. But yeah, and the other thing is with that sketches book, it's good to look at the different editions of it, because there's different colouring in different editions, I think.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense as well. And Ian, I wanted to ask, did you have any thoughts on the Cape Upstart sort of segment in Queensland? Because they have that amazing sort of interaction, and they sit down, and they also talk about how they show each other different techniques of lighting fires, with the glass and the flint and so on. And I just wondered whether whether you had sort of come across that sort of from an archaeological perspective at all, sort of Juru memory or insight into that.
No, not really. Sorry, no.
No,
Yeah.
oh, well, that's all right.
Mike, you know something? I think you muted Mike.
And
Yeah, no, I was trying to think about that actually, where Cape Upstart was relative to Cape Hillsborough, and we've got Porsche's, outrigger canoes down at Cape Hillsborough, where, the one painting there, whether that's a fair dinkum example or not, we're still sort of a bit unsure of. But Cape Upstart, I'm not my memory's gone on that a bit, I think.
I think that it's very hard to locate it actually, because when I sort of searched, a lot of the names have changed. So yeah, which is not uncommon, I think. That
yeah, I think Cape Upstart is still there, regarded as being there. But yeah, trying to remember if any of the explorers that were around said anything about the area.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I've just got a comment to make, Jane. You might know this already, that Daniel Simpson's book on the Royal Navy in Indigenous Australia, it's got some interesting comments about Port Essington. And actually, it's probably the mid-1840s now that he's traced the 2 early bark paintings from Port Essington in the British Museum that came via Haslar Hospital Naval Museum, probably to Richard Tilston, who collected probably thousands of natural history as well as ethnographic objects at Port Essington in the mid-1840s, so just at the end of the period you're talking about today. So in any visual presentation you do, it might be worthwhile referring to those as a counterpoint.
Absolutely. I mean, the record, the bark painting rock art record is just spectacular and amazing. And, there's a whole sort of almost a field, devoted to that. So in a way, that's what, where I was thinking, well, what does the European side of that look like beyond, these iconic sort of images? But I was reading Mark McKenna's study of Port Essington, which is one of the case studies in his book, From the Edge. And he also refers to some of the collectors like McGillivray, and the way that some of the material that was taken from Port Essington, ended up in different collections as well. So I think really interesting.
I'm sorry to say we're really rapidly running out of time. So, and I wanted to give at least a sing out to our Asia, who I think you're in Macassan at the moment. So hello, and Fikri, I'm guessing you're you're still in Jogja.
Yes, I'm in Jogja.
Okay, great. Look, just before we go, first of all, obviously, I want to thank Jane for such a wonderful talk, really generous, sharing with us some really interesting ideas and some fantastic images. And I just, we know that the naval surgeons were really very well trained and extremely good in their scientific, but I could not believe the detail when you were zooming in on that image. I've never seen it that close up. It was amazing, absolutely amazing, quite heart-stoppingly beautiful, wonderful stuff. So before we go, David's just going to, I believe, share a couple of slides for us. And I just wanted to
wonderful.
Finish with this. We were in Macassan last month, and Global Encounters made a donation to the Ramata Arts Centre, Art Space. And today Fikri shared this with me. This is what they have done with that gift as a memorial to our dear Lily. And if I recall correctly, it says something like, who is going to, now I've forgotten, but who is going to make sure that we're all on the same wavelength, I think it is, or something like that.
That's correct, Lynette.
That's it. Thank you, Fikri. My Bahasa is pretty terrible, but I did spend a bit of time on Google Translate. So thank you. Look, all that's left to say is we're still waiting to get a confirmation whether or not we're having a seminar next month rather. So we're just waiting on that. But in the meantime, David will flick to the next slide. And just to let you know, we're hoping that Professor Annie Clark will be speaking next week. Next month on the 16th of November on inland seas, maritime imagery in the Central Plateau of Goupil Island, which will be fantastic. And for our final event of the year, we are hoping, it just needs to be confirmed, but I'm pretty confident, it's going to be Dr. Stephanie Mawson in conversation with Dr. Christy Flannery from the Australian Catholic University. Steph's coming across from Lisbon. She's going to spend the month in Melbourne, so we get to see her. And we will have a little launch, a discussion around her new book, Incomplete Conquests, The Limits of Spanish Empire in the 17th Century Philippines. And that'll be a conversation between those two fantastic scholars of the Spanish and the Philippine regions. So really looking forward to that. All that's left to me to say is good night, and thank you all for coming. And again, thank you, Jane, and absolutely wonderful. That was a showstopper. So thank you so
much, Lynette. Thank you.
No
Thank you,
worries.
Jane.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.